This content is brought to you by Uphold, which makes crypto investing easy. I've been a user of Uphold since 2017. They're one of my go-to exchanges. You can buy, sell, and trade cryptocurrencies on Uphold. You can also trade precious metals and equities. They have 10 plus million users, 250 plus cryptocurrencies, and they're available in 150 countries. As with all exchanges, you can buy and sell on them, but I highly recommend you custody your own crypto. Not your keys, not your coins. If you'd like to learn more about Uphold, please visit the link in the description. Welcome back to the Thinking Crypto podcast, your home for cryptocurrency news and interviews. With me today is Alexandra DaCosta, who's the CEO of Aspen Creek Digital Corporation, which is a renewable Bitcoin mining operator. Alexandra, great to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Alexandra, I'm excited to speak with you because I'm certainly passionate about Bitcoin mining and especially Bitcoin mining happening in the US, given, over the years, there's been a big change, a shift in the lay of the land where miners are positioned, and it's great to see the US is leading. So I'm excited to learn about what you guys are doing and what makes you different. But let's start with your background. Where are you from and where'd you grow up?
Sure. So I'm actually originally from Toronto, Canada. I went to school in Canada and then came down to the US for university and never left. So it was a little bit of a winding path of, taking the jobs I was able to get that gave me the right types of immigration status. And now I'm a dual citizen.
Oh,
so
that's
now
awesome.
Austin is home.
And what did you do before working at Aspen?
So I spent almost the last 20 years in the capital market. So I was on the debt side in structured products and asset finance sales and trading. So I'd spent my career at places like Deutsche Bank, Nomura, Cantor Fitzgerald. And then the last part of my career, I was global head of ESG and impact investing. So that's where I started tiptoeing it more into the renewable space.
Very interesting because historically, Bitcoin and ESG have not been two things that mesh together. So what led to you, saying, I'm going to go work in the crypto industry and obviously specifically Bitcoin mining?
Sure, it was very serendipitous. One of my partners here, David Yee, who's our chief commercial officer, was our head of crypto banking, and so we started overlapping on various Bitcoin mining stories that had more of a renewable bend, right? So whether it was, hydro-powered, et cetera. And what we both started honing in on was actually just the high power utilization of mining Bitcoin, which is obviously what really gets focused on from an ESG perspective, particularly when that, power source is not as clean as perhaps you would like. For us, it was more of a question of if you have something where 90% of the cost is mining, Bitcoin is actually power. Can we do something to isolate and reduce that cost of power? And then in addition to that, can we use this great, consumer of power as an opportunity to stand up new power developments, particularly renewable? And so for us, it was this kind of opportunity to really streamline the business model of Bitcoin mining and really try to isolate this incredibly volatile and incredibly expensive input, which is power. And then also use it as an excuse to say, can we really apply this in the renewable space and really help catalyze even more renewables? And how does that relationship need to exist if it is indeed possible?
For sure. And we're seeing a call for many of the miners and even just bigger industry players, some from traditional finance, such as BlackRock and so forth, saying, okay, we believe in Bitcoin and crypto and blockchain, but we need to fix this energy issue. This is still a concern for many investors, many companies. So you guys are certainly looking to solve that, right? And bringing that solution to the table. And maybe you can tell us a bit about Aspen and how it came about.
Sure. So for Aspen in particular, we were focused on utilizing this new company as an opportunity to catalyze brand new renewable power. And you do that by saying ACDC is going to be the power off-taker for a new, in our case, solar development. So you're really starting from greenfield on both sides. And the advantage to doing that is from a solar development perspective, there is predictability in the off-taker. They know that if they build it, you don't need to wonder if they'll come. They know that if they build it, we're already contracted to be there. And so that really helps financially stand up the solar development side. There's also a lot of advantages for us because we know exactly where our power is coming from. We know the rate, etc. So for us, we were really approaching it from a symbiotic perspective, right? How can we do what's best for solar, and how can we do what's best for us as a data center operator? You are seeing a lot of pressure in the market right now on Bitcoin miners to improve their disclosures, to improve their energy mix. I would caution and say, take a step back and ask why the investors are pressuring you. They're pressuring you because they're under pressure to disclose the greenness of their investments. Yep. Sometimes it's because their investors actually care, but a lot of times it's because there's just new regulations coming down the pipe. I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing. We can get into a different debate about regulations. Sure. But the fact of the matter is, Bitcoin mining has really been targeted because it's an easy target, because it's newer, it's often misunderstood. And so you don't have this unbelievable voting base that is so, connected to it and saying, oh my God, you can't take away my aluminum smelting plant or my cereal, factory. It's like, well, it's Bitcoin mining. 70% of people don't really know what it is yet. So off with their heads. So for us, it's a long-winded way of saying our approach to the why is because we see an opportunity to use Bitcoin mining to stand up new power. And we see an opportunity for this power to positively impact our bottom line. And I do believe in that because of its environmental impacts as well. But I'm not doing it because there's now this big pressure from Wall Street to make us disclose.
Yeah, that's great clarity there on, your mission and the balance as well. Because to your point, there's a whole other conversation with regulations in the government that could be had. So is the renewable energy primarily solar focused, or are there other sources as well?
Right now, we are solar. You will see in our portfolio, which is over the next 3 years, we have optionality to develop an additional up to 3 gigawatts of new renewable power. So we would stand on the other side of that. It is predominantly solar. You will start seeing some wind as well as battery in some of our later projects. Our focus on solar is because that is specifically where our expertise lie. So our founding partners, who are solar developers, have stood up, depending on how you want to count it, over 12 gigawatts of power in the US over the last decade. So that's very much their focus. And so where you see us is where we already have local expertise in that space.
And can you tell us where your mining locations are, which states, and are you planning to go international as well?
So right now we are mining in Colorado as well as Texas. I say mining, we are a mix of self-mining, but predominantly hosting right now. Our third site will be in West Texas. Going forward, you will start seeing us in other states. We are focused right now on the US, again, because we like to focus on where we already have existing expertise. You tend to see us in places where it is a deregulated market from a power perspective, and said a little bit more clearly, where it is best for us to operate behind the meter and where we have this opportunity to integrate most appropriately both with the grid as well as with our power generation. Not all states are equal in terms of how they view that relationship. Some states, for example, will charge transmission or usage charges for the physical infrastructure. If your power goes over a line from your own solar to your own data center, they're still going to charge you a transmission fee. That doesn't really, benefit us with our model. So you see us in states where we have an opportunity to perform outside of those guidelines.
And I've spoken to many other miners. A lot of them are in Texas. Seems Texas is becoming a home for a lot of Bitcoin miners, given the respective regulations there, and they're more, I would say, forward thinking as it relates to this industry. So are you primarily just looking at the US, but maybe in the future you might go other countries or so, or does that too early to talk about that?
I think we have a pretty large pipeline. 3 gigawatts is a big one in the US. Definitely not opposed to other countries, but we like to keep it simple. We
Sure.
like to, as my husband would say, row where you're fastest. And, we have our expertise right now in the specific states where we're active and then the future states that we're looking at. So for an earlier stage company, I don't see a lot of value in trying to color too far outside of our lines because look, power in particular, if you don't have very, very deep, long-standing expertise in those local markets from a market execution perspective, a regulatory perspective, a relationship perspective, it can turn against you pretty quickly.
Hmm. Can you tell us or share any stats of how many Bitcoin you're mining per day? And are you holding that Bitcoin or are you selling it in the markets or a combination of both?
So we are predominantly hosting. So I would say that's something you'd probably want to go look at our partners with. I can give a shout out to our biggest partner, which is Compass Mining. They are filling out the majority of our second facility, which is just outside of Houston. Our other publicly traded mining partners are Galaxy, as well as Neptune. So I would just direct you to them to see what their various strategies are.
Yeah. Okay. Got it. Because you're predominantly hosted. Yep. That makes sense.
Exactly. Yeah.
You last year raised $8 million in a Series A funding round. Tell us about that and who participated and how you're going to be using the funds.
Sure. So that round was co-led by Galaxy Digital as well as Polychain Capital. We had some other excellent partners in the round, but I think, having two powerhouses like that really helped instill a little confidence in what was a very turbulent time. That round closed at the end of the summer. We used those funds to help complete our second facility. So our second facility is a 30 megawatt data center that is co-located behind the meter with 87 megawatts of solar. So that money really went to helping kind of complete that second site and round it out, which was really exciting.
And I know this is a bit long term, but eventually when all Bitcoin are mined, a lot of miners will be making money off of the fees of the network. Are you guys thinking that far ahead, or is that to way off?
Absolutely. Our strategy is, we're vertically integrated through the data center, right? So we design, develop, own, and operate the data center. That gives us flexibility. So, we are hosters right now. We have a little bit of self-mining. We love our hosting counterparties, but we have access to this power for a very long time. And so, we have a very large pipeline that we're about to bring online. In fact, our third facility is a 150 megawatt data center behind the meter with 200 megawatts of solar that's coming online this year. So we're definitely going to have an opportunity to think about that. And so, yes, the opportunity to, generate extra revenue off of fees, how those fees are starting to maybe creep back up in the space is very interesting to us as well.
Any plans to go public? I know a lot of Bitcoin miners have gone that route, but I'm curious if that's on your radar.
Yeah, I'd be lying if it said it wasn't on our radar. We founded the company a little over a year ago. Obviously, it had been in the works for a while, back when Bitcoin was at 65,000, and everyone was going public, and access to capital was a dream. So we have had to reevaluate our strategy and our capital strategy multiple times. So the playbook for not just Bitcoin miners, but a lot of earlier stage companies was raise a couple rounds, IPO. That has changed. There's always the path to IPO. Candidly, at this point, we're really focused on doing, I think, what's best for the company. And so the question is, how are you best going to access that capital and through what channels? And what strategy is going to give you, I think, the most control over your destiny? And do you do that through just more private raises and through, whether it's debt, whether it's equity, whether it's, JV partnerships? Do you do it with larger strategic partnerships? We're definitely open to all of it. I was saying something the other day, like, and it's not just us, right? 2023 is going to be very much the year of mergers and strategic partnerships. And I think you want to see it. I think that sometimes especially in the Bitcoin mining space, unfortunately, we saw a fair amount of destruction in the space. And we've learned a lot from that. I think what you're starting to already see this year with a couple of announcements is really interesting partnerships that are strategically aligned. And so, we've definitely got our ears open to say, what are we good at, right? We're power first. That's where a lot of our expertise lie. And that's a pretty useful skill to have in the Bitcoin mining space. So, where can we make these partnerships? And at the end of the day, we believe in Bitcoin. We also believe in the opportunity to kind of reimagine the role of the data center on the grid. And so I think that there's opportunity to work with, quite a few of our peers in that space.
Yeah, it's a great point. You got to do what's best for the company, and not just because everybody's hopping on that going public train. We, like, to your point, we see how some companies have gone under a bit, and it's tough time for them. Talk to us about your 2023 roadmap. What can we expect?
So 2023 is all eyes on project number 3, which is the one I mentioned in West Texas, 150 megawatt data center. So that is, we are currently in the process of kind of our next phase there of completing the upgrades to, the substation, working on the switch yard, which is kind of laying all of the, telemetry groundwork for then popping up, if you will. So that's what we're focused on. So we're focusing on who we're going to want to partner with at that space from a hosting perspective, what component wants to be self-mining. We've been finalizing our actual infrastructure development plans there. So that's taking up a lot of our focus, as well as honestly optimizing our first 2 spaces, right? Because a lot of what we do is, we're a hosting counterparty, but it is also constantly managing this balance between the solar generation and the grid and our power utilization. So continuing to develop out those, power optimization expertise, the associated software, et cetera. And then I think really starting to be very thoughtful about the role that we're playing as a captive load, right? So while Bitcoin mining is very much the focus, when you have access to 3 gigawatts of new renewable power that you can help stand up, and when you have access to that power for the usable life of the asset, so that's 30 to 40 years in some cases, there's got to be conversations about what else can we do with that power. And it's fun to say that there's all these amazing applications, and a lot of them are accurate, but the proof is going to be in your ability, obviously, to deliver, but your actual ability to figure that out from a legal perspective, from a regulatory perspective, from an interconnection perspective. And so that's where we're really focusing is, what have we learned from hooking up the first 2 sites in a little bit of a unique way, at least in the Bitcoin mining space, and how can we start applying those learnings beyond our existing applications?
On that note, you guys are doing something very different. You're bringing a solution to the table. Once again, despite all the narratives and the regulations and so forth, are you then taking, what your solution here and going to, let's say, DC and talking to some of the folks there? Are you participating in any conversation and advocacy of like, hey, not all Bitcoin miners are using such and such energy, bad energy sources and so forth. Look at what we're doing. We're doing it right. Have you guys gotten to that point as yet?
We have played a role. Look, we are an earlier stage company, and so the limited number of personnel you see at this firm are already wearing a lot of hats. Yeah. And so, that advocacy is a full-time job. I will answer it with this. I think, the saying, to what end and at what cost. And so there are those who are advocating because they are seeking some form of regulatory either change or implementation because it's going to directly benefit them. I don't necessarily have a dog in that fight right now. Sure. We are finding that we are having the best results by interacting with, our partners on the grid, by showing what we can do to be a better partner to them. And thankfully, it's a very clear model, right? Our ability to curtail, to turn on and off at a moment's notice, and send power back to the grid in those times of strain is very beneficial to the grid. And obviously any Bitcoin miner can do that. What's a little bit different about our model is that when we turn off, not only are we not drawing on the power that was allotted to us from the grid, but we're now sending all of that new solar power. So you actually really are amplifying the availability of power to the grid. And for example, in a region like Texas, that's very, very meaningful because of how their grid is structured and the fluctuations in temperatures, et cetera. So my point is, if we're trying to affect change, you can stand on the hill and you can yell until you're blue in the face. But what are you really seeking to change? And for us, what we're seeking to change is an evolution of the interaction between power generation and power consumption. And how do we improve that so that they can work a little bit more symbiotically? How do we make sure that new power is going to places that really need it? It probably involves new transmission. And we're having better luck kind of getting there by doing. But look, we are, you will see some of our data in a lot of the information that's on the Hill. We are very closely tied with a lot of people who are on the Hill right now. And I think we really do need better education about Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. The problem is anyone really willing to listen? And the final problem is that your voice and your interests and your role as a miner or as a hoster is very different from your role, for example, as a custodian. And it's very different from your role as an investor. And it's very different from your role even as an energy provider. But unfortunately, right now, those voices are kind of getting muddied, right? So they go, oh, ACDC, Bitcoin miner hosting counterparty. You must be related to FTX. It's like,
Yeah.
not even remotely. But as long as that's where this dialogue's going, we'll just be over here working on our power contracts. And I think that's really, probably my personal stance more than anything. But there's only so many hours in the day, so we're going to focus on our power strategy.
For sure. And to your point, you guys doing it right, working with the local governments and so forth, let them become advocates of the work you're doing versus joining the herd in DC. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but to your point, it's very muddy, it's very noisy now. A lot of people have a sour taste in their mouth after the FTX debacle, and they kind of, to your point, lump everything together. But we have to get that clarity again.
Exactly.
On that note, though, over the years we saw China ban Bitcoin mining. A lot of miners came to the U.S. Mining is booming in the U.S. From the mining pool data that I saw, the U.S. is leading right now, and it can tend to fluctuate from time to time. Any concerns of a Bitcoin mining ban? I don't think we're going to get there, but is that like a risk that you'll think about? Like, hey, what if Elizabeth Warren gets her way or something, right? That could be a possibility.
From Massachusetts, yeah. It's always a concern. I think we feel very good about operating in Texas. But you also have to think about the relationship between mining and the energy sources from which it's drawing, and what good, and I use that term loosely, but what are the advantages for the state in which you're operating? And so there are states that are going to be friendlier to attracting new types of businesses. There are also states where things like Bitcoin mining can actually be more complementary to the grid than other states because of how those grids are actually set up. And so that's, I think, where we're really focused is, again, not playing this like hot potato game of where's it going to be banned, where's it not going to be banned, but taking it a step further and saying, where am I going to be additive? And where am I going to be, as one of my clients said a long time ago, referring to Bitcoin mining as the raccoon of the energy space, and I always love that because it's like such a great picture, but they're not always wrong, right? And so raccoons are kind of a pain. So if someone's going to perceive you as a raccoon, you're probably going to have a harder time, setting up shop. So I think that that's where we're trying to approach it, is like, Is a ban worrisome? Yes. But if we're interacting with the grid in a way that is complementary, whether you're mining Bitcoin or you're an aluminum smelting plant or you're a green hydrogen facility, going forward, you need to make sure that your relationship with the grid is complementary. And I think all climate techs are showing that they're going to need a lot of new power sources. You're going to need a lot of new, transmission lines. So starting to be more complementary, I think, is going to get you furthest. So that's why I have more confidence in our strategy and worry a little bit less. But yeah, I mean, there's definitely some states where I put it back to what I said earlier. Focus on what's important to those states. And if the extracurriculars that, accompany Bitcoin mining are not high on that state's list, if new power generation sources are not high on that state's list, or if from a tax perspective, they can't have a material impact on, those local communities, it may not be the best fit.
At a larger theme from a macro level, we still need a lot of clarity in the United States, and there's a lot of moving parts and components because you have other assets outside of Bitcoin, right? And there's a question of what's a commodity, what's a security, but also the SEC has not approved the Bitcoin spot ETF as yet. You have members of Congress on both sides of the aisle who are now waking up to this and they're becoming advocates, but we don't have the numbers yet. So what is your take, in addition to, possible Bitcoin mining ban, and then the global competition? We're not the only horse in the race here. You got these other countries, Russia and all these others who are mining Bitcoin as well. Do you think the United States, I guess the long-winded question here, do you think the United States can get it right soon, maybe this year? We can get some comprehensive regulations and, okay, here, Bitcoin miners, here's what you can and can't do. And cryptocurrencies, digital assets, NFTs, here's what you can and can't do, and things along those lines.
Ooh, that's a good question. It's two very different questions. So you've got the financial regulation, right? Whether it's, commodities, security, et cetera. That's a very interesting power struggle. I don't know what upside there is for me in trying to figure out who's going to really win that battle. But I think the fact of the matter is that it is an industry that has more and more investor dollars flowing into it.
Yeah.
And it needs some form of oversight. There is risk, there is leverage.
Right.
It would be ridiculous to just assume that, that doesn't need any kind of guardrails. Even just from, tax reporting perspectives, right? You're looking at the big accounting firms struggling to make sense of it all. So Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, they're not going anywhere, right? So it's time to kind of address it and say, let's pick a horse, right? And let's just call a spade a spade. It's either going to be a commodity, it's going to be a security. I have my own opinions about that, but whatever box that is, just put it in it and let's move on with that. From a Bitcoin mining space, I really don't think that we're going to get a ton of clarity. I don't see a US ban on it. I really don't. I think that there's far too much infrastructure that's been developed. There's far too much, frankly, good that's coming out of it, right? Even with everyone belly aching about Bitcoin mining, whether it's the energy uses or the fact that this shouldn't exist and it's just a fad and it's not a store of value, all of these statements that I personally don't believe in. But interestingly enough, I don't know that I would have felt this strongly about it a few years ago because I really, 5 years ago, I didn't understand it to the degree that I do now. But I also misunderstood just how much we use the infrastructure underlying the blockchain, right? If you were to say to someone, fine, we're going to put a huge moratorium on Bitcoin mining, we're going to ban all blockchain, the amount of daily channels that would be closed off is unbelievable. And I think that that's something that day-to-day regulators and politicians and everyone else standing on their soapboxes is not recognizing, right? We've crossed the Rubicon. There's no going back. So to ban it is only going to put it into other hands, right? I mean, it's Bitcoin, it's in everyone's hands. I get it. But the point is, I think that the US is not going to do something so drastic. How we're going to start arguing about what's allowed, what's not allowed, what regulations need to occur, what disclosures need to occur, I think that's going to be a moving target for a really long time. And again, I think it matters of what are we solving for? Are we legitimately solving for using Bitcoin mining as an opportunity to actually improve our grid? If we were, then I actually think you'd see Bitcoin mining as a really great catalyst for kind of this free market response to there's a demand for power, so let's actually now start building more transmission lines. If we're going to just try to squash it and regulate it away, I think we're kind of missing the point a little bit here.
Yeah. I'm hoping they can get it right, but to your point, it probably won't be for years. And at the end of the day, I don't think the US wants to lose the battle over crypto as well in a way that other countries can surpass them. We got it right with the internet, and that did well for us economically and obviously innovation and so forth. It seems there's more pushback on this at this point, but hopefully they can get it right. Hopefully, we can all come together and pass the clear regulations, the guardrails, and let innovation flourish.
I agree with you. And I think at the end of the day, it's just coming down to sometimes a lack of understanding. Look, Bitcoin, it really, I know it's been over a decade, but from a general populist perspective, it really has just kind of been shot out of a rocket. Right? And you hear that it's up, and then you hear that it's crashed, and you hear that it's up, and you hear that it's crashed. And when you're not really kind of living it on a daily basis, it's sometimes hard to understand why it could possibly be behaving that way other than it's fake. Right. And then you start seeing things like NFTs. And again, if you're maybe from a different generation, or you're just not in, this kind of day-to-day world, you don't necessarily see that around all of these new terms that you've never heard is infrastructure that's actually improving the security of financial transactions. And it's making financial transactions cheaper. And so that's, I think, what's really interesting, that if we could take a step back and say, forget Bitcoin, let's talk about actually how the security of it works and how else we can use that infrastructure. I think that we might have a lot more buy-in, right? And that's where we come back from a power perspective. If we think about our power needs in the US over the next 20 years, and we would like to see more of them be renewable, well, wind needs to be built where there's more wind, and solar needs to be built where there's more sun. And that doesn't always happen to be right next door to a city, which is how historically power generation assets were built. They were built right where they were needed. And so we're going to need to think of transmission solutions. Bitcoin mining is starting to do that, right? We're starting to go where there's an advantage for us, where it's cheaper for us to access power, or from a regulatory perspective, it's easier for us to access power. You can learn a lot from the Bitcoin mining space and start applying those learnings to things that currently are on the top of the political agendas. So that's where I'm really hoping, to your point, that we get it right, because we got the internet right. And had we shunned it, we could have really been laggards. And so maybe you don't necessarily like what you think is making the headlines in our space right now, but if you took a look under the hood, I think that there's a lot of common good that's going to come from this latest innovation, revolution coming from mining, if you're being honest.
And something that's interesting, and it's happening in El Salvador, we're seeing other sources of energy are going to be used to mine Bitcoin, volcanic energy. And it just opens up a lot of opportunities for monetization of energy and creating jobs and boosting the local economy and so forth. So I'm really excited about the future of Bitcoin mining and like things you guys are doing, which has been very innovative. What are your thoughts on just a non-traditional energy sources being used to mine Bitcoin?
I think it's great. I think it's doable. I think we're going to see it. And I think what's so lovely, if you can use that term. But what's just so wonderful about Bitcoin mining is that it is a very forgivable load, right? So load being something that is drawing power. With Bitcoin mining, you can turn it on and off. And you're not interrupting anything, sequential, let's say, right? You're not losing any work. It also doesn't take an hour and a half to power up and an hour and a half to power down.
Mm-hmm.
And so let's just put our thoughts and our values about Bitcoin aside for a minute, right? We support it, but let's pretend you don't. Fine. Then let's just make this a science experiment. You have something that is enabling you to utilize intermittent power sources and not really get upset and destroyed by that. There's not a lot of things that allow you to tinker on a small scale as well as a very large scale, right? Windstone, 700 megawatts, right? Ours are 30, there's about to be 150. We've got one that's a 6 megawatt. There's a lot of people that are home miners. You can interrupt that load no matter how big or how small. And of course, you got to treat the miners with respect, and there's certain conditions they prefer. But you can learn a lot from that tinkering. Mm-hmm. And when you start tinkering on a bigger scale, not only are you starting to learn maybe how we can start introducing batteries, some form of heat reclamation technology, so that any escaped heat can now be used for fish farming, for breweries, for greenhouses, for you name it. You have the foundation of a really, really important science experiment. And I think that is the magic of Bitcoin mining, as we've not ACDC discovered it, as we've been discovering in our role as trying to use it as an interruptible load. In our case, helping to utilize the data center as this bidirectional node of grid on the power. But when you think about it from a global perspective, the things that we're learning in that interruptibility of the load, and then how you could maybe use an interruptible load with different types of power sources, and then how you would physically build it, how you would legally paper that, how you would work with the regulators, how you would work with the grid. That's really cool. And there's a lot of amazing developments that are coming out of that you're going to start see being applicable to massively important technologies, right? When you look at green hydrogen, when you look at green ammonia, even if you look at little things like household draw of power, there's some really cool technologies out there. You see them a lot in Europe, where they're little, I don't know if you've seen them, and I wish I could think of one of the company's names, but they actually kind of do like little micro flutters to your home energy usage. So this thing will literally help rebalance the grid by very quickly turning on and off your home's energy. You won't even notice it, but it'll be just enough that if all the homes in the neighborhood do it, it helps to rebalance the grid. Those types of technologies are very similar to what we're doing. And so when you start thinking about, okay, how much can we interrupt a specific load in order to help the grid? And does it have to be for 3 hours at a time? Or if everyone did it for 4 seconds at a time, would it have just as beneficial as an effect? Those technologies are really, really important, and I think are going to play a massive role, particularly in developing countries where energy is often more interrupted, and those energy sources are less either dependable or typically more renewable, so you only got solar part of the day. It's going to be really interesting to see, what version of our Post-it note, right? The accidental discovery comes out of this.
For sure. Tough question for you. Do you see central banks holding Bitcoin as they do gold, given that Bitcoin is digital gold, in the future?
I think they should. I really do. I think that the conversation of some kind of localized digital asset, I think it might be missing the mark a little bit. I guess the question is, why does a country hold gold, right? Where did the gold standard come from? Probably another podcast, but we're just going to assume that we agree with the gold standard, and that we're supportive of the security behind it, and we're supportive of this notion that everyone agrees that gold is going to be our backstop method of currency, right? If you believe in that, then you should probably believe in Bitcoin being the alternative store of value. Obviously, your security comes from the decentralization of that, not the buried in a deep hole surrounded by armed guards centralization of the security, but from a scarcity perspective, right? There's only so much mined gold. There's only so much Bitcoin from the security perspective. But I think my personal opinion is that it should be one single currency, the way that it is one single precious metal, right? You don't have every country holding their favorite stone, right? We've all agreed that it's gold. So I think that honestly, it makes the most sense to pick a horse. And in this case, I think Bitcoin, that's my personal opinion. You know, you've got the proof of work, you've got the security, you've got the limited, float. It seems to me to make the most sense from a as close as possible to gold. And if we're trying to replicate that, I can't, I guess said another way, I can't really think of an alternative, right? You can print more dollars, you can fake more dollars. I can't personally think of a different alternative other than maybe clean water as well, something else that's limited and but that's going to be a hell of a lot harder to hold. So
right, and also not as verifiable as the blockchain, right? I can know what Bitcoin's moving. I can also know, to a certain degree, oh, this wallet belongs to, I don't know, the Russian central bank, and this belongs to the Fed in a way. And you can verify that simply with blockchain analytics tools, excuse me.
Exactly.
Yeah. So out of Bitcoin, you had this entire industry and asset class that was birthed, and that led to smart contracts and tokenization and different blockchains being created, and then DeFi and so forth. I know your focus is on Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining, but what are your thoughts on how things have expanded and you have all these different use cases now?
I think it's really exciting. I think what's been maybe unfortunate over the last couple of years is that, especially last year, is that we saw the effects of a little overeagerness. We saw the effects of mislabeling, right? Is yield really yield? And so I think that conceptually, the layer 2 and lightning and various I'll say offshoots of the kind of the original blockchain technology, I think it's really exciting. And I think unfortunately it was relatively inevitable that we were going to see some folks, whether they intended or not, but run away with some of these opportunities and overinflate them. And so I think what's really unfortunate is that a lot of whether it's the Lunas or, pick something that really went south last year, it's really shaken investor confidence. And because we are still such a nascent industry, it has really kind of thrown the baby out with the bathwater, and kind of made everything in Bitcoin and cryptocurrency and digital assets and use the buzzword, but seem implausible. And I think that's really a shame, because we are starting to lose, or I think for a while we lost sight of all of the incredible advancements that are taking place. And now, ordinals is at the tip of everyone's tongue, and how that's going to, affect the blockchain in particular. But I think that overall, it's unbelievable to see the amount of infrastructure, digital infrastructure that's being built, to start seeing it being applied in other sectors, seeing, the blockchain being utilized in, health research, right? Research and development for really obscure diseases. So you can now, we have this wonderful company here in Boston where they're really able to kind of like democratize the R&D life cycle by saying, look, instead of having to raise $100 million to be relevant to, name the very large pharmaceutical or healthcare company, it actually only takes $2 million in order to do these trials. And so if we can track that progress on the blockchain and we can invest on the blockchain, we're actually able to make much greater advancements with much smaller quantums of dollars. That's an unbelievable breakthrough that I think is often getting lost in all of the fireworks of, kind of some of the, I'm just going to call it silliness for lack of a better word.
Yeah, and it's the tech is moving fast, and because there a lot of the gatekeepers, it's decentralized for the most part, right? And a lot of gatekeepers out of the way, anyone can almost launch a token, and on one aspect of it, it's great because you get more entrepreneurs, more innovators, but then you also got scammers who come and try to take advantage of it. And scammers exist in every industry, in every tech, booming tech or new tech. And what happened with FTX, that was just old-fashioned fraud, like a la Bernie Madoff. But then you had your Celsius and so forth, and the Lunas. So it's just, this is why we need the regulations, right? To gatekeep a bit, but let the innovation flourish as well. Let the good actors be able to build and do their thing.
Yeah, I agree. I think, the tokens for me remind me a lot of the trials and tribulations of the derivative space. So, my background was in the debt markets, and a lot of derivatives there, a lot of CDO squared and cubed, and wraps and everything that everyone read about in in The Big Short and Too Big to Fail, and that was unfortunately or fortunately for me, fortunately, because it was a wonderful group of people, but the environment that I grew up in. And you had derivatives that were created for two reasons. Sometimes it was in response to exposure that clients wanted, and sometimes it's in response to someone's bright idea, right? That if we can do a derivative off of this, we can make twice as much money, or this is a way for us to offload risk that we don't really want. And I'm not saying that it was all, misguided, but I think we, especially in this new tokenization world, we really have to understand, why does the token exist? And does it exist because someone wants access to a new sector of the market, right? Is via tokens, can we invest in earlier stage companies and get shares of those companies in a new way? Does that help the companies? And is that something that the investors want? Or to your point, is the token just a scam trying to ride the latest wave? And I think that that's where we're at, is that anytime there's these new financial technologies, because let's be honest, every 10 years there's a new one, either you don't understand it and you get caught off sides, or you do understand it, but it breaks anyway. That first breaking is kind of the thing that seems to be the constant. And it seems like we're there with the tokens as well. There's a purpose to some, right? There's a lot of talk of green Bitcoin. There's been a lot of talk of tokens and why they need to exist. I think there's a lot of value if there's someone that legitimately wants to seek exposure to it and has no other way to do it. Maybe there's a fit. But if it's a token for the sake of it because you think you're going to ride the wave and monetize the wave, it's probably going to have either a bad or at least not a good impact on the broader markets.
Kind of a curveball question for you. So the crypto industry has been primarily male dominated. There have been more women entering the industry, which is a great sign. It's a breath of fresh air to have someone as yourself being CEO versus, a lot of the male faces and so forth. What's it like? What has been your experience, being a woman in the industry and being CEO as well? And what would you say to other women who are looking at the industry and looking to enter as well?
That's a good question. I, for better or worse, have always spent my career in male-dominated industries, so I don't know what that says about me or the industry. So, it's nothing new for me, but it is a shame. I will actually tell you that my impression of the Bitcoin mining space, because that's my only focus, and hosting, let's say, there's a lot of women, and they are absolute powerhouses, right? Amanda Fabiano, head of mining at Galaxy, also on our board. Amanda Cavalieri is now also on the board of CleanSpark. Jamie Leverton, CEO of Hut 8. I mean, Hut 8 is just stacked with women. There are, and I'm naming three of many, Patty Trumpeter at Spirit 3D, goes on and on and on. So on a per capita basis, there's actually a lot of women in leadership roles, and I've literally just left off 8 wonderful women that I saw most recently. So no offense there, but I actually think you'd be pleasantly surprised. I think what's pretty cool about I'll call it crypto space. I keep jumping around with my terms, but I'm trying to be all encompassing. Is that because it's decentralized, because it's all about innovation, good ideas, everyone is welcome and everyone is supported. I remember my first real kind of crypto conference that I went to, right? And I come from Wall Street, where it's like, I hate to say it, but it's, it's khakis and blue blazers for the most part, right? And I remember going to this conference, and I didn't know if I was at a concert, if I was at Comic-Con, if I was at a Wall Street thing. Like, you had it all.
Yeah.
And it was awesome. Right? Because it's just like it is decentralized to its core.
Right.
But you're right. There is still what seems to be this kind of male-dominated side to the industry, and I think especially the vocal side. And I think that that's maybe where we're getting it wrong, is that Bitcoin, and this is something I've been getting used to, lives on Twitter. So, I mean, I didn't think I was that old, I'm in my 4th decade. I feel out of it. But I do see that a lot of the voices are few and loud, and I think it's a little bit misrepresentative, because I would actually argue it's a pretty supportive group. But what I would say to more women getting involved is, jump on in, right? Like, it is cool to see more and more women coming into seats that are, innovation driven and technology driven. And especially with my overlap into my interest in climate techs and earlier stage technologies, some of the most interesting climate tech companies and software companies are coming from women. And I've been super fortunate to be able to be part of some wonderful female CEO and founders networks, and just kind of women supporting women. I think you're going to see a huge change. And you didn't ask this part of the question, but as a mom of 2 awesome boys, this post-COVID hybrid environment. I mean, you see me. I'm sitting in my home. There's a frog and a lizard on the other side of this wall that I hope are still in their cages. As a woman and as a working mom, this has been unbelievable to be able to have some access to a hybrid environment. And I do think that, yes, you have to be on site for Bitcoin mining, but again, this space is a lot more creative and willing to buck the trends. And so I do think that you're going to see women that often will leave the workforce when they have little kids and feel that they can't do it all from a scheduling perspective. You're seeing more of them be able to stay. And I'm definitely one of them. This is not for the faint of heart. This has been one hell of a year. And I think having the ability to be able to balance my life, whatever sad attempt I made at it, I think it's more possible in this industry than a lot of industries. I honestly wish more traditional finance would follow suit.
Good stuff. Yeah. And to your point, I've seen more women entering the industry, which is great to see, because it was, when I got in like 2016, it was a lot of crypto bros and crypto Twitter, of course, which still continues.
Oh, it's that world. I actually enjoy it. And the funny thing is, like, there's a lot of wonderful information there. So, it's no, I'm not throwing shade on Twitter, but that's for me been really, I think the biggest learning curve is where you get your information from, where the access to information is.
Yeah.
It's a wonderfully collaborative community, this crypto planet. People really are willing to, of course, chirp a lot, but they're also willing to be very transparent and really put it out there. I'm just so new at where I'm supposed to be getting my information from.
Wait, are you on Twitter? What's your handle?
I am on Twitter. So we have ACDC underscore HQ, and you just put me on the spot. The hardest question is, what's my Twitter handle? I think it's Alex underscore DaCosta. But yeah, I'm there.
I'll link to it so people can
It'll be
follow you.
nice.
Awesome. I got some wrap up questions here for you. If you could create your own metaverse, what would the theme be about?
Oh, oh man, that really is the hardest question. If I could create my own metaverse,
Where would Alexandra escape to if you put your Oculus on and you know?
oh, wow, that's a cool one. This is a super cheesy answer. I think it'd have to be right here. I'm trying to picture of kind of somewhere that would have a really amazing perspective. I mean, I can say, vacation and go to Asia, and I can say that it would be, being able to still live in Canada a lot of the time. But I made a conscious decision to leave my last career. I made a conscious decision to, take a risk and to join a whole new group of people that I didn't know in an industry that I was new to. And I honestly, this might be it. This is pretty cool.
Oh, that's awesome. Got some rapid fire questions for you. Favorite food?
Probably sushi.
Favorite musician or band?
Tragically Hip.
Favorite movie?
Dumb and Dumber. I'm really building myself up here.
No, that's one of my favorite. Like, it's one of those. I grew up in the 90s, so I watched Dumb and Dumber. It's just so good. Like,
it never gets old.
it never gets old. Favorite book?
The Fountainhead.
And when you're not, doing any Bitcoin mining activities, what you're doing for fun as a hobby?
I am doing anything I can with my friends and family. So it usually involves being outside, skiing, swimming, just I know, again, this is going to sound dorky, but just being present and having an opportunity just to be grateful that we've got such good friends and family. Doesn't really matter what we're doing. I could be freezing my tail off outside right now. I'd still be pleased.
Well, Alexandra, pleasure chatting with you. I got to have you back on as things progress with ACDC, but thank you for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me.